Live. Good afternoon. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're hanging out with some pollsters who have been watching this election closely. Joining us from Connecticut is the director of the Quinnipiac University poll, Doug Schwartz. The University of New Hampshire Survey Center director, Andy Smith, joins us from New Hampshire. And in New York City is our very own director of elections, Anthony Salvanto. And here on set are two delegates to the Democratic National Convention, Ohio delegate and state representative John Barnes, and Florida delegate and Southern director of Project New America, Loranne Ausley. They'll be asking a few questions of our pollsters as well. We hope that this will help everybody understand a little bit more about polling. So let's get started. And let's start with Daniel Seberg, who is here with Google. And Daniel, let's start off too with what Google is doing this election cycle. You guys are doing some really exciting stuff. Tell us about it.
Yeah, sure, Nora. So in addition to having this Google Plus Hangout studio that we've got going, we're also live streaming both of the conventions at youtube.com/politics. We're, of course, showcasing our search and trends data as it relates to both the candidates and voters looking for more information. And we've been taking a look at some of the search trend data that's been happening over the past week and the past 30 days as we get closer to Election Day. And it's fascinating what it reveals. I think pollsters are interested because it's almost a sort of a pulse of the internet in terms of what people are interested in, and we can really break it down both geographically and over time.
So give us an example, for instance, when Paul Ryan was announced as Mitt Romney's running mate. What did you find out?
Yeah, well, we can actually tie it to both Paul Ryan's the announcement of him being his running mate, but also his speech. And so if we pull up the graphic that we've got, you can look minute by minute at what people were interested in. And in particular, we saw some spikes that were related to when he mentioned that his mom was his role model, that he had a playlist that contained songs from AC/DC and Led Zeppelin. And, you know, people might have been just interested in finding out more about their own interest in AC/DC or Led Zeppelin. And then when he referred to some of the slogans that he felt were tired and not being lived up to on behalf of the President Obama side of things. So, you know, it's interesting to be able to see each of those little spikes and how it relates to people having those two screens while they're watching the speech. They're both, you know, they're watching it and they're on their device at the same time.
It is very interesting. Daniel, thank you so much. And let me bring in our pollsters. Anthony, let me ask you about that. What we know from Google and what they're finding in those trends, does that relate at all to polling?
Yes, it does. And what's really interesting this year, obviously social media and online mobilize voters. We see it a lot. We ask questions about whether folks have been contacted by the campaign and how, and whether they're using social media. And you've seen a steady increase in that. It started up in 2004. It really went up in 2008, of course, with the Obama campaign. And it's continuing now. So it's a continual, very strong increase there.
And Andrew, from your perspective, what have you learned from Google Trends?
One of the things that I think is going on still is that a lot of people get their information from these different trends, but they're still getting it from traditional sources. So the internet is very important in providing information, and certainly the campaigns are doing whatever they can to try to drive information to voters. But we're still seeing in New Hampshire and some of the other states that we're following that most people are getting their information about this kind of the old-fashioned way. It's just coming through their computer screen now than it might have been through their newspaper on their doorstep or on their television set.
All right, Doug, let's talk about this election because we're here at the Democratic National Convention. We were just, of course, in Tampa last week for the Republican National Convention. A lot of people keep looking at the national polls that are out there that show this race neck and neck. People look at the national polls and say no bounce for Mitt Romney or maybe a little bit of a bounce. Do the national polls matter, or is it the state-by-state polls that will tell us a little bit more about what's happening in this election?
Well, sure, the national polls are important, Nora, but we are focusing on the swing state polls here at Quinnipiac. We've actually partnered with with CBS News and the New York Times, and we're doing a series of swing state polls in Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Virginia. So we believe that that's most important because of the Electoral College. I mean, we know in 2000 it came down to one state, Florida, in 2004, Ohio. So we are focusing on the key battleground states.
I know that's my interest, and I'm glad that we at CBS have partnered with Quinnipiac, if I can just add that in, because I'm states where Mitt Romney has a lead.
One, and that's in Colorado. So in 5 out of the 6, Obama has a lead. It's generally a small lead, except for Pennsylvania, which most analysts now are thinking pretty safely blue. But in our poll, Obama was up by 11 points in Pennsylvania. That poll was taken several weeks ago.
And interestingly,
the other states are very close. Looking at Florida, our most recent poll 2 weeks ago, it was a 3-point lead for Obama. Virginia, 4-point lead, and Ohio, a 6-point lead.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, let me ask you, do you think most voters have made up their minds?
I would say most voters have, but one of the things that's going to be key is in the battleground states that Doug was talking about is that the reason they're battleground states is because the states are pretty evenly balanced between Republicans and Democrats, and that small percentage of voters, usually the ones who are moderates or independents, the people who don't pay as much attention to politics, those are the ones that are up for grabs still. And we're seeing in New Hampshire, it's somewhere between 5% and 10%. I think you're probably seeing numbers similar to that around the country. But in this kind of a close electoral environment, a difference of 5% or a difference of 2% might be the thing that decides who is the next president.
No doubt. And Anthony, you are with CBS, and tell me what you've noticed in some of the polling that we have had this year on this presidential race. I mean, we hear from the campaigns how it's virtually static, and it's kind of hard to believe because we've had almost $500 million in ads already spent, with each of these sides trying diligently to try and convince voters and move this race one way or the other, and yet it remains fairly stagnant, not just in the national polls, but I think for the most case in the battleground states. Mitt Romney has to make up a lot of ground because Obama won by a huge margin in the last election, and as we just heard from Doug, it's only Colorado thus far where he's leading, and maybe perhaps in North Carolina. There was a local poll here in North Carolina that suggested that Mitt Romney may be up a bit. But Anthony, can Mitt Romney win if he takes just Colorado and North Carolina away from Barack Obama?
No, I think he's got to probably win Florida, probably win Ohio, at least one of those. He does have a few paths to victory, even without a couple of those big states, but it just becomes much harder for him. I would, though, circle back to one point. What's
that path to victory?
His path to victory?
Yeah.
If he takes one of Ohio or Florida, he can still make it up, even if he drops one of those. So, for example, if he were to win Virginia, if he were to win, say, Florida and Virginia, that would be a big start for him. If he were to then add through the Midwest, if he picked up, say, in Iowa, which he certainly could, maybe even Wisconsin, which I still think is a toss-up. And, this sort of comes back to the point about the national polls. There are common threads that we see across a number of these states. So, for example, if Obama does very well with women again, or in particular white college-educated and white suburban women, as he did in 2008, that will help him enormously in Virginia and in Colorado, and probably in Wisconsin as well. But the coalitions are a little bit different. If he, say, doesn't do as well with the white working class as he did in 2008, then that puts a string of states like, say, a Michigan or an Ohio in more jeopardy. So there are some connective threads that run through, and you might see states go back and forth in clusters.
And if I could just tie in the trends data to that for a second, because we've looked at the economy as an issue and where people are searching for that. And if we look at the battleground states in particular, we've got a map that shows where all this is happening. But in Nevada and Wisconsin, we've seen them rising dramatically as people look for issues related to the economy. In this case, we searched for terms that included debt, deficit, and unemployment. And you can see just by looking at that map where pockets of the country, this is of major interest to them. So I'm guessing that pollsters are interested in this, candidates, and of course we're seeing this from voters that they're keen to know more about this where they live.
So Daniel, explain the map and what the colors on that map mean.
Sure. So the darker the blue, the higher the search interest in issues related to the economy. So if we're looking at Nevada or Wisconsin in particular, we can see that those are 2 out of the top 4 in terms of interest and people curious about it. Now, of course, it's sometimes tough to measure sentiment. People might be looking at this from all sorts of different points of view, but certainly the economy as an issue overall is critical in those pockets of the country where we see that darker blue.
And Daniel, did we learn anything about searches from these conventions over the past 2 days, things that people were searching as they heard different speakers? I mean, certainly when there's, different breakout stars that are new to a convention, as in the Republican National Convention, a lot of people know Chris Christie, but when there's a Marco Rubio or something like that, and then certainly last night here, the Democratic Convention with Julian Castro, do we see a lot of information about people searching to find out more about those people?
Yeah, absolutely. If we take the first night as an example, and we see that Michelle Obama spiked, she was up actually 500% over normal searches that are done for her. Number two, you see Julian Castro. A lot of folks were interested in the mayor of San Antonio. Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts, a very powerful speech for him. Cal Penn, the host of this webcast. There's actually a very funny ad that the Obama campaign put out that's been very searched and looked at on YouTube. And then Lilly Ledbetter, who led this fair pay suit. And I think a lot of folks maybe saw her, didn't know much about her, and were curious to know more. And so that's sometimes what we see, is that people are getting that context out of the ability to search on the internet and see it in real time.
I think that's so interesting to see what people are searching and what they're interested in learning more about. I want to bring in some of the delegates who are here at the Democratic National Convention, get their perspective, and also allow them to ask questions of our pollsters who are gathered here. First, Congressman Representative John Barnes, who is from the Cleveland area. Thank you for joining us. And Loranne Ausley, who is from Florida. So, Representative Barnes, let me ask you, you are from Cleveland, an area that went for Barack Obama in the last election. When you hear these pollsters talk about the national polls, battleground states, you know a lot about politics, but were there any times when you sort of scratch your head and say, what does this mean?
Well, sometimes you do, Nora, when you look at the questions that are being asked and how they're prefaced to people. For instance, if you ask a question about who will you vote for, it's a direct question. It's the indirect questions about the process that raises certain issues to determine whether or not the polling operation itself supersedes the question.
Okay.
And that's extremely important, particularly when they're asking about whether or not the president should do this, that, or the other, or whether or not the president should have another term. You think of that, you have to look at the questions.
And what do you mean? Do you think there's sometimes some bias in the questions? Are you concerned about the questions? Or?
Well, I think that the way that you ask questions is important because it doesn't tell the whole story. For instance, someone will say, well, what has the president done about the economy? Well, we could talk about that for an hour and all the accomplishments that he's had. But if you ask people in general about that without giving them the story about his successes, and you ask them about it, most people don't pay attention to a lot of that. And as a consequence, it could have a measured impact on the effects of the poll. I would be interested in understanding from some of our experts here on that.
Andrew, do you want to take that? Or?
Oh, sure. I think that the representative is absolutely right that the questions that are used are critical in determining what goes on with these things and how we interpret public opinion. And I think one of the mistakes that we often make, and as journalists too, is that we assume that the public knows a lot about the issues that that candidates are talking about. And what I've seen over the years is that a lot of the questions that we ask about specific issues are, we're essentially playing a little bit of a game where we pretend that the respondent knows something about this issue and has thought a lot about the issue, and then the respondent pretends to give us an informed response, when in reality they tend to be responding to some of just the words that are in the question at the time that we're asking them. So you have to be very careful about that. You have to make sure that you give the respondent lots of opportunities to tell you that they're unaware or they don't know about these things, just so we don't really measure what we call non-attitudes.
Right.
And I could
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to quickly add, sir, you raise a great point. And one of the ways that you can put aside some of the issues that you raise is look at long-term questions, ones that have been asked the same way year in and year out. Because what you see there is when you look at movement in those questions, you can imagine that whatever biases, if you will, if you imagine there are some, have already been sort of teased out over the years. So the ones about concern about the economy or how you're going to vote, have often been tested over years and years, and it's the movement that you can pay attention to. So that's one way to tell that a poll is moving in the direction that's in reality, as opposed to something that's just been because of the way the question was asked.
Loranne also joins us, Loranne Ausley from Florida, another battleground state, of course, where we're going to see these candidates a great
that
deal.
We're going to win.
And tell me what questions you have.
Well, just to kind of follow up on that, I think it's important, there's so much information out there. We're in a building right now where everyone's on multiple devices, and, it's so critical. We have some great reputable pollsters that we're asking questions of, but anybody these days can put a poll out there and ask 3 people, and if it's not, I think it's things like this, forums like this are so critical because people do make up their minds based on what they see, and to make sure that we are validating that the methodology is accurate when we get those.
And I have to say, Loranne, we have standards at CBS News, and I've been a reporter who covered Capitol Hill for many years and have been in politics, and so we know which polls we think pass the standard, have the right kind of sample size, and we try and be very diligent about using certain polls and not using polls that we don't trust their methodology and putting them
and
on the air.
I think it's so important because you're a trusted news source, and just opportunities like this so people see, because you could go on the web and Google anything and find just about anything you wanted to. So this type of opportunity is great, but I would also love the opportunity to ask a Florida-based question.
Yeah, please.
We are a battleground state, and I'm wondering, we talked a little bit about Romney's path to the presidency. I mean, we've been told time and time again in Florida that he doesn't have a path without Florida. And how much does the sort of Romney's selection of Paul Ryan and his position on Medicare, how does that impact the battleground state like Florida, and is there a path without Florida?
Well, let me go ahead and ask Doug Schwartz with Quinnipiac, because we've done polling in Florida with CBS and Quinnipiac, and I think we've asked about the Medicare question, right, Doug?
That's right, and we did see a slight narrowing of the gap after the Ryan pick. Obama was leading by 6 points. And then after Ryan was chosen, the lead went down to 3. But it's not clear in Florida that change was due to Ryan. In Wisconsin, I think we saw more clear evidence of movement towards Romney because of the Ryan pick. So we did see some narrowing in Florida. As far as Medicare goes, we did ask about it, and it seems that it's an issue that does play in the president's favor in our 3 swing states that we were polling on that issue. More people trusted President Obama over Mitt Romney to handle that issue, and didn't want to see the kind of changes that Republicans have been suggesting to the Medicare program.
But it is interesting, while more Americans trust President Obama over Mitt Romney when it comes to the issue of Medicare, the Republicans and Mitt Romney still have an advantage with older voters, correct?
That's right. President Obama has the advantage with younger voters, but Mitt Romney has the advantage with seniors.
Yeah, so it is interesting.
Some work to do.
Yeah, it is. And Loranne, let me ask you, Florida's a big state. It's an expensive state to buy media in, but you guys have already been bombarded by television ads, correct?
Yes, and I haven't seen, I won't get the statistic right, but it's something like 1/3 of all of the money that's been spent in the states, in the country, has been spent in Florida, and somebody can correct me, but it's a very large amount, and it's and it's just begun, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and Representative, Ohio, the same thing. Ohio is a state, no Republican has won the presidency without winning Ohio. If you talk to people inside the Romney campaign, they acknowledge it's a very tough state for them to win. That's why they've been running those tough ads, accusing the president of reducing the work requirements and welfare, ads that Bill Clinton tonight will call outrageously false.
Well, I think, Norah, also in Ohio and Florida and around the nation, one of the issues that you have to look at is the fact that Governor Romney has not given a lot of detail on exactly what he's going to do. He spoke the other night, and I'm still wondering what the point is. What is his plan? And without that clarity, I think that it gives us a great opportunity to raise issues about the programs that the president has in place and lay out the case as to why he should be reelected.
Gotcha. All right. Well, this has been a very interesting Google Hangout.
Sure.
I've enjoyed being here. And so I want to thank everybody, Daniel Seberg, who is with Google, Andrew Smith with the University of New Hampshire, Doug Schwartz with Quinnipiac, Anthony Salvanto with CBS, Representative John Barnes of Cleveland, Loranne Ausley of Florida. Please continue to join us here on Google Plus and at CBS News and Face the Nation. I'm Norah O'Donnell. Thanks for joining us.
In broadcast.